You're listening to stories written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along to the stories I read, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. You're listening to Nearsighted, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. It was fall and the leaves were changing. Some had turned yellow in the tall trees that lined sections of the streets near the river. The leaves stood high above the trunks below, and looked to the near-sighted like fruit. Though not near-sighted himself, he had made the same mistake by glancing at the trees out of the corner of his eye, thinking that they were fruit trees, and then thinking that this wasn't the season for fruit, and then that besides, if it had been fruit, it would have been plucked by now or else fallen off the tree and rotted. On this afternoon, as he passed the trees by the bridge and the river, he remembered his mistake. Then something occurred to him. Once you knew that you had been fooled, and knew how the trick worked that your eyes had played on you, it was hard to forget and let it happen as it had before. He stopped to see if this was true. He couldn't make himself forget, not now anyway, and maybe never. He kept looking at the trees, now with something else in mind, and thought ahead of what he saw to what it would become. Now the healthy green leaves surrounded those of a sickly yellow. In time, the green would turn yellow, and the yellow would fall and leave the branches they had decorated bare. There would be only yellow leaves, and the emptiness of the bare branches would come to surround them. The temperature wouldn't swing wildly then, as it had done lately, but would become more like what people expected, something they could count on and prepare for. Thinking about this, he turned to bring the river into view along with the trees that had confused him. He liked the sight of the trees against the soft blue of the sky and the harder, deeper blue of the river. Further on, the river, itself clear and always colorless, took on the color of what lay underneath it and became a murky brown. There were places where the rocks stuck up out of the river so that the water came up against them. The water left thin white trails behind as it did so, and they dissolved soon after they formed. They had a pattern of breaking and of being replaced, advancing and receding, that reminded him of a flag waving in the wind. There the rocks were large enough to break the water's surface, while it passed over the rest unharmed. The white of these trails was the only color the river could really call its own. The collision happened at no great speed, and without the violence needed for there to be foam of any kind. Over the river was a bridge, and along the river was a trail. Crossing the bridge, people glanced either at it or at the trees absent-mindedly, dividing their attention between where they were going and where they looked. He had seen this trail many times, and whatever he had imagined that the trail might lead to, it was for the longest time not enough to make him do more than imagine. Eventually, however, his curiosity got the better of him. It turned out to be only a trail by the river. It led nowhere that suggested whoever had first set out that way had had a definite purpose in mind, nothing beyond what had made him follow in their footsteps. He went on until he didn't want to go further, and had lost all hope of finding anything. Coming back the way he came, he saw people looking at the trail and down at him from the bridge, a few of them meeting his eye with the curious looks they gave him. The leaves could soon start falling and make a carpet on the ground. Moving through the gathered leaves, people made a scraping sound as if shoveling their feet. Then, with the sound of leaves in their ears, they had no choice but to think of them, if only briefly. Sometimes a leaf got caught in their hair or their clothes while they were underneath the trees. This stuck with them a while longer, at least until they brushed it off. He thought of such a leaf like a hand on his shoulder, and it didn't bother him to let it stay as it was, allowing it to fall in its own time and lose its perch as he kept walking. The crowds of feet that passed over them daily stamped them flat, and the same people, as well as the wind that came through from time to time, swept them off the path. He himself liked to sweep the leaves with the inside of his feet, piling them to one side of the road or the other, or off the road entirely. It gave him the pleasure it had given him as a young boy to kick a stone in his path. It astonished him a little to see others do this too, as if he should be the only one. The leaves that remained decomposed unnoticed. That was the most sensible explanation he could think of. He never saw anyone sweeping them up, so he figured that was how it must happen. His neighbor's trees to the west of his house had fooled him too. They were closer to the ground, their leaves a dry brown for the most part, not like the green of those by the river, though also with a few bunches of yellow in between. In hindsight, he could see why he had mistaken those yellow bunches on the neighbor's trees for something other than what they were. It would have made sense for fruit to grow at that height, though not with dry leaves all around it. He couldn't remember what fruit he'd taken them for. He tried judging them by their color, and remembered he hadn't thought that far, that he had thought of them as fruit without considering what kind. The question, had it come to him, would have resolved itself as he came closer and had seen them for what they were. It was time, anyway, for trees to bear, not fruit, but chestnuts. If leaves were a hand on the shoulder, then the chestnuts that fell from the trees in the park were a knock on the head. He put his foot on a chestnut and rolled it around with the front of his shoe. Once he was done, he kicked it away, lightly, again with the inside of his foot, then reconsidered, went over, and, bending down, pocketed it on a whim as a sort of a memento. Children picked up chestnuts too, and threw them at each other or collected them in their pockets and carried them home. The lamp scattered about the park, standing at level height with the lowest of the branches. Just came on at dark. Once you knew where they were, they couldn't surprise you again, though they surprised you the first time if, like most people, you leaned forward a little as you walked, kept your head down, and didn't stop to look around. There were sweepers for the park. They came in the morning, and he might see them while walking. If the wind was strong, it blew the leaves off his neighbor's trees toward his house, and he would have to rake them up. If his neighbors took care of it before the wind blew them over, or the wind didn't have the strength for it, there would be nothing to rake up. There was nothing by his own house that could make such a mess, and nothing, hedge or fence, to separate and protect his house from another's. It was rare that he had to remark on the state of his neighbors' lawns, which he did, obliquely, to remind them to take care of them, and to have something to remark on besides that they had seen each other. The knowledge of what he wanted, what he expected of them, could pass between them in this way because of what had happened several years ago. He had seen what the wind and their leaves had done one day and gone over to tell them about it, a little heatedly. He had only described the problem, not given them the blame, and they had taken it to heart, a fact he noted with approval. With what he said about the wind and the leaves on their lawn, and their being blown over to his lawn, he had, despite his annoyance, managed to talk about it in passing, avoiding accusations of neglect, and not wanting to be accused himself of looking for a problem. To find who was at fault, he had looked upwind, and because it was most commonly the western wind that was the strongest, it was the neighbors of the house that lay in that direction that he spoke to most often. It was so commonly the western wind that he was always a little surprised whenever he felt it coming in from the east. His neighbors remembered what he had said, even when even when they only saw each other and there were leaves on the ground, raked or unraked. That was all it took. However friendly he would have been otherwise, his mood was markedly better if you should see that they were, or had been, attending to their yards. They remembered what he had said better than he did. Still, there were times when they forgot. Still, there were times they forgot. He preferred winter to fall for this reason. Snow stayed where it fell until it melted or was shoveled or salted, and should it fall and pile up on his neighbor's lawn, there was nothing that could make his neighbor's problems his own. In fall, the leaves covered over half their lawn, and in summer, their lawn had to be cut down so that they wouldn't have to trudge through the tall grown grass. Visiting them, he had heard his neighbors joke that they cut it so the leaves could cover it again next fall and not be spread too thin. They had a backyard too that they cut in the summer, but no trees to cover it. What the wind blew over it to his house when they forgot their raking wasn't much. A moment's work, the leaves few enough to be picked up by hand without it becoming a ridiculous ordeal, without it feeling ridiculous. Should he speak to his neighbors about the state of their lawns, he'd see their children attending to it later that day, sometimes with their father. Speaking to them, he wondered if the children knew they had been sent out because of him. The older of the two was most often alone. Their father sometimes went out with the younger son, not wanting him to feel singled out between himself and his brother. His father, while they raked, held himself back to work at a roughly even pace with him. Each should have his share of work, and his son shouldn't grow up to think that work was such a bad thing to be put off for a later date. He and his neighbors had stood in the yard, apart from the boy, he watching the boy work, and his neighbor explaining it to him. As he listened, it sounded like something the man had told his son as well, or like a reply he held in reserve for when his son said something that deserved it. The first time the boy had been sent out to rake leaves, he had been sent out alone and shown himself reluctant. It had been quite sudden and unexpected, and so also disconcerting, since he had never been made to do it before, and there had been no warning that this would change. His father, having closed the door, observed him through the kitchen window while he watched the news. The man said he kept one eye on the news and one eye on his son. He knew from experience that this couldn't be true. Those who said it meant they looked very rapidly from one thing to the other. There was no one who had the concentration or a wide enough field of view to really divide their attention like that. It couldn't be done, much as he might pretend. Shivering in the late morning cold, the boy crossed his arms and refused to touch the rake. Then, slowly, he began to work in earnest after spending some time only pretending, lazily grazing the leaves with the rake. He threw himself into the work he had resisted the prospect of being let back inside, though the morning was just a bit warmer than it had been when he started, far from his mind and of no importance to him. That was what his father had seen, but there was more to it than that, things he could only guess at. Some of this nobody could have known, nor could his son have explained it all if he had been asked. There had been no thought to his son's refusal, no idea of outlasting his father and being allowed back inside with the work undone. It was simple and point blank, but in the cold he couldn't sustain his anger for long, though that was where he had the most reason for it. His work done, he stood looking at the pile of leaves he had raked together at the edge of the lawn. His expression was hard to place. He was a little flushed and was resting, not waiting on his father to come and not feeling much pride in his work. His father looked out and saw he was finished and realized he forgot to give his son something to put the leaves in. Regretting his mistake, he went out meekly with the roll of trash bags in hand, the mere sight of him and the roll of bags being, he figured, explanation enough, and helped his son pack the leaves in the bags. As the man spoke of how his son had come to assume this new responsibility, he had made it sound as if it had happened years ago, but he couldn't tell just how far back it was, whether it was a matter of months or even of weeks. He had wondered why the man was telling him this, and decided he had no better reason for it besides that they had come to know each other a little better, and that the sight of his son raking had reminded him of the incident. Certain people thought nothing of telling you such things, and he suspected the man had told his other neighbors about it too. They didn't have the same arrangement with their children as that neighbor did, or if they did, they didn't show it, and the circumstances in which he and they had met didn't invite talking about it, nor did they have much on their property to tend to. He had gotten to know them too. He knew some of them better than he knew this man and his sons, but none of them had welcomed him into their lives quite like he had. Without any further introduction, the man had told him about himself and about the lives his children lived, small and easy to overlook for people meeting someone new. The man talked about himself and his sons, mentioning the older son as the brother of the one who was present. That was the situation in which he found himself at the time they met. Everything else was left out of the picture. He had felt such an immediate liking for them the first time he met them that he would have joined them in raking the king if he had seen they had a rake to spare. It was a feeling he knew he would remember as he felt it, something that would mark that day in his memory and continue to mark it even as his memory grew hazy and he forgot the exact date. They were also more often in the yard than their neighbors, not always for maintenance, but simply sitting on the porch and more often out of the house altogether, and in this way they made themselves more approachable. After hearing how the man had sent his son out that morning, he paid more attention to him and thought about what he had seen of him lately. Cold and lazy he might have been then, but that wasn't how he remembered him from the time they'd last met. His face was fat and he wore a black jacket for raking. He worked quickly, the work and the jacket helping to keep off the cold and buying him time until the cold finally got through to him. Having learned from his father's mistake, he had set the roll of trash bags on a chair on the porch. He retrieved it and filled a bag with the leaves he had raked, leaving the bag at the curb to be collected later that week. The boy's father, standing to the side, watched his son work and spoke of him with approval. He talked to himself, but as if inviting people to reply. Thinking of his chestnut, he took it from his pocket and presented it to the man. He asked him whether he had anything growing in the backyard, and said that if he planted it now, he would soon have work to keep his son busy, no matter how the fall came next year. He hadn't talked as loudly, as invitingly, as the boy's father had. He didn't think the boy had overheard him, as he had probably overheard his father. He left it up to his father what they would make of his gift. That was Nearsighted, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, if you'd like to read along as I read these stories, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.